Kernel Building Kernel, Friday, November 18th. And I am going to start, as per usual, with the quotes for our gathering. This one comes from the Converse section on the website under True Voice and reads, "Always the breathing in and the breathing out of life, always the language of a living cosmos expressed in the stories of the people. There I will find the way to read the wisdom of the world, the language of which is embedded, spoken into the inner being of humans. It is ours to know." And I chose that one because I'm going to take just 5 minutes, I promise no more, before we dive into reviews, to share just a few thoughts about pattern and how that applies to design, dialogue, and lineage. And the thing that I really want to highlight for everybody, if you remember week 0 in the syllabus, there's this notion of the play of pattern mind, and complementary opposites. In particular, we have these complementary structures, the learn track and building a better web together, because the best way to learn is to create. The only way to create meaningfully is to learn. And we move through these complementary opposites, these two poles that inform and contain one another over and over again in this three-dimensional spiral that breathes in and out at different scales in a kind of fractal rhythm. And within those structures themselves, there is again that fractal notion of the complementary poles. You have the personal and the Web3 inquiry. So at every part of the structure, there are these tensions, these dyads that pull us into an understanding of how the world is contained, and contained within that is the pattern of wise interaction, of living well together. The reason that I think this is really relevant is because when we look back, I know this particular pattern, the notion of complementary opposites, is very, very old, right? The way that it came to me is really through Plato, who talks about it in terms of reflux and efflux. You have to move from the world of 10,000 things, what the Zen teachers will call ji or jihokai, the world of manifest dualities, into an appreciation of the oneness of being, rihokai in Zen. That's efflux, reflux in Plato's imagination, the movement up from this world into wisdom. But there is a complementary movement down through the music and the madness, and that happens through compassion, right? It's Avalokiteshvara in Buddhism, and Kuan Yin, if you go further east, this enormous compassion for the world, the bodhisattva who comes back, the realization of the oneness of things through action, right? Meditation in action, Chogyam Trungpa, all of these people who talk about having recognized this wise perspective and thing, you have to enact it in the world, in relationship, in entanglement. That's how we really not just recognize, but realize oneness in action. So we move back down into the world. There is this pattern. Plato really gets it from Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes comes from a much older myth about Thoth in Egypt. Egypt is once called Kemet. In Kemet, that lineage of thinking about these complementary opposites comes from the Western trade routes across the Sahara in Mali and down what is called the Nilotic Meridian. In Zulu, it's known as the Lunga Magakashe, right? The Golden River in Africa. This place that holds and grounds so much of the simple pattern and wisdom about the way to interact with the world in a holistic and delightful way, with joy, consciousness, bliss, that kind of stuff. So this pattern is really old. It's not limited to Africa. You will find it in Aboriginal imaginings of the world too. This is from Tyson Yunkaporta, a book called Sand Talk. The thing that I really wanted to focus on, although there's a lot to say about this particular image, is what he calls dreaming mind, right? The dream time. You might have heard of this in Aboriginal stories, and it's this symbol here. Again, you find sort of reflux and efflux, the two worlds, the world of practical action, the world of the dialecticians and the world of the constructivists, abstract thought, the dream. The ability here is to, through metaphor, understand how we can move to an abstract understanding of things and then ground that abstract understanding of things through practical action in relationship with one another. That's what the dream does. It is, in his words, an interdimensional ontological enactment held in a complex of social rituals, right? That's what dreaming actually is. The word is not well translated into English. And you find again the same fundamental pattern which we're looking at. The reason that I bring all of this up, and I am running out of time, is just to say that we can do this too in the way that we design services. Remember, kernel itself reflects this pattern and, as far as is possible, ought to across all of the things that we build. And right now, if you, like as we work toward a unified flow for people coming into kernel, thinking about what that looks like and how we can make it intuitive and understandable at every level, my submission is that this is one way to approach it from a design and lineage perspective. Also, it plays into, like the modern understanding of this idea, complementary opposites, dream time, whatever you want to call it, is cybernetics, right? You might, if you're an engineer, imagine this as feedback loops, right? Think about Pask, Pangaro, Doubly, the notion of conversational software, the work that Doug Engelbart was doing on networked improvement communities, and so much stuff comes from there, right? This feedback loop is an incredibly powerful thing because it applies not only to the tools system, but also to the human system in Engelbart's view of the world. I want to just show one thing here, which will hopefully illustrate kind of what I'm talking about. So we've had a lot of feedback about the complexity of how things are currently imagined. And that seems to be fair. When you land in the wallet, there's like a lot of stuff that you can do, and it's not this clear dreaming pattern of the complementary opposites that allow you to go either way, right? Into the world or into your own deep abstractions, your own dreaming, and then recognize that it actually all ends up in the same place anyway. So let's save that, explore the wallets. Oopsie. So let's just, here we go. This is what the wallet now looks like if we merge my PR, which I know that there's a lot of work still to do on it. But instead of lots of different things, the same pattern, which is like, are you a new user? Are you importing? Again, we find it like, do I want to go and explore stuff for myself? You don't need to join kernel to use our tools. If I go here, all of the things that are familiar to us in terms of the faucet, the transactions, the ERC20 token contract, and the NFT is there. Or I can go and this clearly I've not tested quite correctly. If I'm a new user, it should say apply to kernel, not explore. I've got that wrong. And in a live demo, of course, it's not working, but it should say apply to kernel if I've just created a new wallet, and then if I've created a wallet and I am a part of kernel, then it says explore kernel, and it takes me to all of the things that you're used to with a little welcome home message. And if I'm a new wallet, then it should say apply to kernel, not explore kernel. It takes me here, and I have sort of rejigged the process here based on some really amazing feedback that Boyana did about like the steps and trying to explain them better. And then that takes me into kind of apply now. And I have explained to people that they're going to be taken to that sign up screen. And if I have successfully submitted an application rather than just seeing the form, I get a bunch of stuff here. The first link of which completes what I wanted to show you today, it returns me to the wallet. And in particular, it returns me to the wallet view this is obviously not on staging yet because we haven't merged the PR, but it would return me to the wallet view that has this stuff that I can immediately start using and learning from. And that's what I really wanted to illustrate through like the stuff about pattern thinking, is that like once you've got to the end of the application, you ought to be able to go and use the wallet immediately, just as if you actually use the wallet and do a bunch of stuff, we can like direct you toward the application. So you can move between like this ability to explore stuff on your own, to move through the song lines that other people have traced, the memory of our collective interaction with the software, just as you can go and meet the community and the people who actually kind of hold this knowing and hold this exploration. And through dialogue and through spending time with one another, you can then understand how to better use the tools which are embedded into our shared environment, which are already there in sacred places or song lines or communal ways of navigating the land, our relationships, all this kind of stuff. So I know that there was a lot in a little while. I didn't want to take too much time because A, I haven't got my PR entirely right. Sorry, Simon, my bad. And B, I would love to spend the most of today talking about reviews and who gets to review, what affordances we provide, and what it means once people have passed the initial review. Focusing on that, but I thought that the patterns would be nice to have in front of us as we talk about that. So we can think about these feedback loops in modern engineering language, or dream time stories in older languages, or messages from the gods if you're a Hermes Trismegistus kind of person, whichever, pick your metaphor, I don't mind. So all of that said, I think the best place to start with stuff about reviews, Boyana, is maybe with you, just to hear like a brief overview, if you have it, of your perspective from talking with reviewers, what they thought, and how that might inform, in particular, like the affordances that we give people, how we make it possible to vote in the reviews app. It would be wonderful to start there.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I'm still quite sick, but so that's why I didn't have opportunity to do very deep research in the last week. But okay. I'm not super prepared in with this. But if you have any like specific questions that I can answer, one of the main stuff was around being able to kind of on one side manage their time and being able to see in an easy way what they have reviewed, what they haven't, and what they have left for a little bit to think about. So the one of the kind of hurdles was around when they're not completely sure whether it's a yes or a no, and they want to like mull over a little bit. There were a few problems there. One was not being sure and wanting to have some input from others in order to kind of mitigate bias, but at the same time they were kind of also they kind of needed some help from like another pair of eyes in order to like talk it out with somebody. And the other was to if they have taken responsibility about reviewing somebody, and they already, even if they haven't yet given them like a vote or any kind of assessment in the system, but they are thinking about it. They've gone out for a walk, or they need like a few hours to think about it, and somebody goes in and just reviews them and it's already done. They saw it. This is again, I only had this opportunity to interview 2 people, right? So it's not as representative as I would like it to be. But just this feeling of, okay, I invested my time and effort in assessing this person, and now somebody else came in and reviewed them. So a little bit of this like sunken cost of, it's not sunken cost, sorry. It's just this feeling of wasted time. And the other thing was around people who had more free time on their hands had more say in the decisions, which was seen as not like as potentially skewing again the who comes in and who doesn't come in. And for overall, it was important for people to be able to not just let people who they agree with in, but to provide opportunity for diverse groups. So the common goal between the reviewers was to allow diversity in the organization and to allow for people who can benefit positively from the program. Like, for example, they can learn or they can change their mind. So it wasn't the reviews, the assessment wasn't around, do I vibe with this person and do they represent the things I kind of believe in, but is this a person that can both get value out of the program and can we allow for just for this diversity and for growth. Yeah, so I don't know if there's these are the things that come to mind at the top of my head as things that stayed. So there were a few more things like being able, like so far they've done Airtables, right? So kind of being able to like follow what has been reviewed, what hasn't, even like to manage their own kind of little batch. The other thing that I mentioned already was the kind of ownership of like saying, okay, I'm going to review these 20 people, and unless I say I need some help, like like it's my ownership. So I'm responsible. I'll deliver it by the deadline, but don't just like take it. Yeah. And yeah, just to be able to like filter for different things. I'm not super sure. Yeah.
Wonderful. Just a few things I want to pick up from that and open it up for like wider feedback and questions, because like it's really, even off that small sample, but it's really, really insightful and so helpful as always. So thank you, and please feel better. Most importantly, the two important things for me, like that I think are really worth discussing for the rest of this call are like, this first thing is about like, how do we want reviews to happen? Is it like people doing it together? Because that's like a lot of the feedback is like, oh, when I was unsure, I really wanted to reach out to somebody and kind of have a look over it together. Sometimes that's healthy. Sometimes like there's confirmation bias and you kind of like together people sort of lower their standards and they're like, oh, I'm not sure, but like you said yes, I was kind of like on the fence, so like let's just say yes. They kind of like default to the lowest common denominator, which is it's just worth being aware of as you think about that. But the reason that this is really interesting to think about is incentives for reviewers. Like incentives is something we need to think about a lot in kernel building kernel in general, both for the people on this call in terms of like those who are actually building kernel, like what are the incentives for it, but those who are using services in the sense of like doing reviews, growing the community, helping out with like these operational tasks. What are the incentives for them doing it? And like you can think of incentives as being along a spectrum. The sort of like on one side is the intrinsic, I get to spend time with people that I really like, I get to learn, I get to be exposed to really awesome people, and it's just this intrinsic motivation to like greater knowledge, greater self-knowledge improvement, this sort of stuff. There's like middle of the way stuff, which is like the social incentive, right? Like, and that's where like review parties or doing it with others or these kinds of things that like, it's not just about like validating your opinions. It's like, hey, I got to spend like an hour with Lisa, like doing stuff, and like, I like spending time with Lisa, but also like we feel good because we actually like did something. So like, yay for that. There's like that kind of incentive. And then there's like the explicit, like financial incentives, which can also like be a part of the whole thing. So like that's like, how do we want people to behave when doing reviews, and how does that relate to incentives is one question. And the other question is what you mentioned at the end there, Boyana. The like for me, the review criteria currently, like, is this somebody that I would like to talk to? And it's interesting that your research so far has shown that it, like, people imagine it in their heads much more as like, is this somebody that's like good for kernel, willing to learn? And I think that those two things are quite different. Like, is this somebody that I'd be willing to talk to and share my time with? Whereas like current reviewers are imagining as like they have this big responsibility to this abstract thing called kernel, by which they measure the reviews that they make. And so it's interesting to discuss that in terms of like behavioral patterns. If anybody would like to dive into either of these questions, like incentives, and I see Brent, so off you go.
Yeah, and I just want to take a second to say how happy I am to be here again. Andy, you brought me back down to earth at the beginning of the call, so I appreciate that. I think it's interesting, that note, how like it sounds like there's even some like patterning and expectations around the reviewers, like they're anticipating what we might be looking for, of like not extractive, but like that sort of relationship of like, okay, is this person going to be good for kernel? And like that puts it in a certain mindset of like, I don't know, versus just, is this somebody I want to talk to? So I don't know if there's like de-patterning we need to do around that, if that's what we're looking for and that's what we're saying, but then people are still like, yes, but people are contributions. And so how do we have that happen? I don't know. I just thought that was really interesting.
I just saw a question actually in the chat. How do you say they describe their role or responsibility, and what their concerns were about and paying attention to? So in terms of role and responsibility, they felt they're kind of the ones that should be kind of living the kernel values, and kind of this, it was both positive and negative, of like the gatekeeper of, this is the values kernel stands for, and this is what we should be, promoting and letting in. But at the same time, they didn't like being put in the position of being the people excluding others. And they were very much concerned about bias. And even around, like, one person said, like, I see, let's say 5 applicants from India. To me, they look very much the same. The only thing different between them is different schools. And I would have loved to like be able to speak with somebody who has more context of that culture in order to be able to assess. And in these cases, they were more likely to, unless it's like a complete no, like it was clear that people haven't put any kind of effort in their applications, which was the clear no. They were more inclined to give them a shot, at least for an interview, to join the discussion, and then to get more information from that. And they were concerned about whether they're following, because they were like, yeah, I think I live kernel values, but what does kernel really wants to allow in the community? Like what how does, like, this nebulous kernel assess generally things? So like both of them were hoping for a little bit more clearer guidelines on things. They were happy. Actually, one of them, every time before they sat to read the applications, would go and read the short guide in order to kind of ground themselves and center themselves on, okay, these are the things that we're looking for. These are, kind of the things we want. Still, they were both of them were very sensitive to their own bias and seems like make sure that they're not just, being exclusionary and removing opportunity from people. I hope that answered your question.
Amazing. Lisa, would you mind voicing your question if you can, and telling us a bit more about permeability, and then we can maybe go to Sal for the context, geography, randomization, groups. If you have thoughts about that, Sal, would be good. But Lisa, first of all, welcome to KBK. Lovely to have you.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
say a bit more about permeability. That seems interesting to me.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here and really love and appreciate the conversation. I've seen a lot of different, like my backgrounds in leadership development. And so because of that, I've been exposed to a lot of different programs where I think some things are really intentionally and creatively designed, like thinking about evaluations, not as evaluations, but as self-reflection exercises. And so as people consider their experience, they might be providing you feedback, but it's also their way of reflecting on what they brought to something and what they feel that experience has offered them. And so I think there's ways when you talk about whether it's evaluating at any stage of that, or even how people get brought into a program, there's the traditional way of thinking about it more like gatekeeping, like we are Kernel Building Kernel and we set up these gate points that intentionally people move through. And then there's also this idea of like the co-evolution that Charles brought up, or Engelbart's stuff of having these almost like a more nebulous nucleus sort of vibe, where there's these levels of permeability where people can fill out a reflection versus maybe like an application to reflect on their sense of like readiness or willingness to want to go deeper down the kernel rabbit hole, if you will. And that depending on how they feel through that process, that can present them with ways to engage. And then from there, they can choose whether they would go through like this door or that, a little bit more of a choose your own adventure, but one that's still curated, but the advancement through that is less a decision that we would make and more of a decision that they would make for themselves. And then I think it is not bad to have an identity. I think sometimes kernel or programs want to be inclusive to everybody, but in doing so, it can leave people feeling less supported in their own journey. And so I think the question is, how does kernel maintain what I think is an extremely magnetic and exciting identity almost in and of itself, while allowing it to be fluid to the people who make it up and who will evolve it, but not in a way where it leaves people feeling like they're floating or unsure. And so I don't know if any of what I'm sharing is making sense, but I think there's I think a lot of creative pockets that sometimes traditional programs overlook, especially when it comes to evaluations and opt-in and co-evolutionary practices with participants and facilitators.
Incredible. I love that. You should write a copy, please. Vision statement. So Simon has brought up a good question here, and Juan has it right that like the question of like who gets to do reviews is then like a self-reinforcing or recursive function, because like who gets to do them now then defines like how they happen and who gets to do them going on and who gets into the community. So like that's actually the place we also need to perhaps like spend the rest of today having a look at. I wonder, like, Sal, if you would be willing, there's some thoughts that you shared with me about like a randomized subset of applications being available to anyone using that randomized subset to work towards federation, these kinds of ideas. And I wonder if you have some thoughts about like who gets to do these and how we define that, how we don't define that, how we let others define that, whatever it is.
Sure. Yeah. Can you hear me okay? All right.
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, there's a few things that I think it's worth us thinking through that a few balances to look for here. So I don't know. So the first thought to your point, Andy, that comes to mind is looking at, like, for example, Optimism's retrospective grants and their reflections on how that went. And to Juan's point, how we see those recursive functions work in other Web3 communities, particularly. And then there's a bunch of stuff around how do we strike a balance between this emergent view of fellows choosing other fellows to get in, and from their perspective, and a more holistic or say deeper view perspective or broader view, depending on how you look at it, that I would just characterize as when you're curating a peer learning community, there are selection decisions that require a depth of knowledge and sort of nuances to maintain, right? So, and how do those all fit together? So, and then there are some of the stats that we could share as well, Andy, if you feel it's right, on sort of second and third order effects of selection that we're seeing. So yeah, should I just try and like high level all those 3 points, or where would you like, where would you like to expand
on? I think that's like the main drive here is just to frame this as well, is to say that like the easiest path forward in terms of like technical implementation is to let anyone review. If we go any other way than that, we need to have like clear reasons why and like proposals for how. So like it seems that like point 2 and 3, like the specific curation of peer learning communities being important and the self-recursive nature of like whatever criteria we apply are the most important toward understanding, like, do we let everybody review? If not, why? And if not, how? Simon, also, and I see a hand from John, so both of you perhaps, and then back to Sal. If you want to share those stats, I'm very comfortable and happy that you do. So Simon and John, just on that. John.
A question. When you say, do we let everyone review, does that mean, I mean, conceptually, does that mean letting 1,000 people read all the applications and vote if and when they like? Or does that mean allowing everyone who would like to sign up as a reviewer, get some training, read some documents on the review criteria, whatever, and then get access? Because that could be two very different things, it seems to me.
Yeah, I very much agree. They are different things. The way that it's currently implemented is the first one. Anybody can see all of them. And this is what we're discussing. The ability to sign up and go through training is like an interesting idea. It plays into those like social incentives, you know, like review parties, come and like hang out, spend some cool time together, talk about reviews, but also like other kind of things. It's like certainly one option.
I'm just thinking that would also be allowing everyone to become a reviewer, just with the extra step of also committing to it and having a clear body of reviewers.
This is, I was just going to say, this is where permeability could be a thing too. Even if you want to allow everybody to be reviewers, you'd still want to have, you know, reasons why and how. And that would be things that then would be articulated for people to opt into, of understanding the why behind the process and the how you'd have to go about that. And so, and then they could choose and, you know, still have the clarity of guardrails, or knowing if they're being helpful in a way, but that anybody would be able to opt into that. Still, just, I think there's potentially areas and pockets to play there.
Yeah, I think I just thought of briefly, Andy, what, you know, obviously we can restrict things, which just pushes the can down the road, right? So then we have to decide who we're restricting it to, and like, how are these people being elected to being restricted to? So that's just what I'm really asking is, and I think, Joanne, absolutely, you know, I think, you know, accepting a, you know, the review criteria and having a common understanding of how to perform reviews is absolutely something that I think is very essential. And it's just, you know, again, it's part of how much is it gated. You know, is it a quiz that you take, and if you pass the quiz, then, you know, you're being granted access, or do you have to do, you know, 5 test application reviews that you perform, that then another set of more experienced reviewers reviews and gives you feedback on, and then, you know, when there's agreement on that, then you're being granted access to, you know, perform actual reviews. So these are all things that we can technically implement. This is really, there's really no technical limitation. This is really all about, you know, people problems and policies, and what we collectively as a group think makes sense. And it's just about expressing those, what those criteria are. And I think that's sort of, you know, who's doing it and what those criteria are, and you know, what information we collect during the application stage, right? That's all very well connected, obviously, right? If we, you know, if we're feeling like, oh, we're exposing too much personal information through the application form, then we should just ask for less information up front, right? So that is not an issue for reviewers, right? So there's many different ways of solving these problems, and I think it's really about, you know, yeah, understanding what is it that we're asking for people, what's the expectation we're setting with them, and then how does the group, right, decide whether that's a person we want to move on to the next step. And I think that's the other important part, right? This is just part of the initial review. What we can do, which we haven't discussed, is we could go back and then ask for additional information once that initial hurdle has been cleared. And then obviously we all agree that at some point there should be, you know, a face-to-face sort of meeting where that's currently called the interview, right? Where we're having a discussion in a smaller group. That will then, you know, give additional feedback, and then we having the same problem, like who's doing those interviews, what's the information we're collecting during that feedback, and then how do we determine how to then either tell the person like, no, you're not a good fit, or yes, you're now part of Kernel. And I think that's sort of what I'm just trying to get at, is just making it very explicit what those steps are and who's involved in what, you know, starting with the criteria and then who's doing it, right? Is also very important. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. And then the technical implementation, there's many different ways of doing it. But starting with, you know, more on the policy level, obviously, that's, you know, I can't do the technical side without knowing what the policy side is. And I think we're just not quite have that agreement. I think maybe Vivek, you want to speak up? You're saying you have some very strong feelings about who should be doing reviews.
Yeah, I
I'd
mean,
love to hear that.
just like as we look at the possible permeations, I suppose, is to Joan's question on keeping it more private. Maybe there's a maximum number of views. Right now, as Andy puts in the chat, as many people as would like to look at one application can. but maybe after 5 or after 7 or after 10, we've had enough information. And it is worth noting that, like, yes, the current 15-point system like doesn't work, in my opinion, in that regard, especially if we're like looking for like 15 like reviews. For example, 15 clap hands, which each give 1 point, gets you to 15, and then that kind of takes you to interview. But should that? Probably not necessarily, right? So one thing, as you mentioned, Simon, was reduce what we collect in the application. I think that we've done a good amount of that. A trade-off at a certain point when you reduce information collection is just richness of profile, which could be a good thing. And that's just like one thing. Another one is limit number of reviews so that all 1,000 or all 100 or all however many reviewers cannot see an app, but really only a maximum of, let's say, 7 to 10. I'm not saying that's the right approach, but that's another way to keep it a little more internal. And then one thing that isn't here, but previously was in Airtable, was just like an I don't know, which I guess is implicit in that, like, I don't have to do anything. I can just like maybe click next, or like at least click back and just go to like something else if I don't feel like reviewing one. But I don't know if that would be a more kind of, it would be a nice feeling to be like, no, I actually looked at this one and my feeling was, I don't know, or I don't have enough information to say, not an implicit one. Relatively scattered thoughts, but yeah, ultimately, I don't think the kindest approach, I basically agree with John's comment in really what started in Slack. I don't think the kindest approach is for like a large group of people to be able to see any application, unless we're very, very explicit about that. But I just don't know if that's the kindest approach and that it will ever be.
So this discussion reminds me of liberating structures pattern of 1 and then 2 and maybe then 4. And they simplify it to after 4 is everybody. But something like setting a minimum number of reviewers is perhaps 4. And each reviewer should talk to one other reviewer about it when they have done. So the first with the second and the third with the fourth. And then afterwards, the 4 should consider notes. If 4 people is enough to make a decision on someone that works. If they're unsure, maybe you look for another 4 reviewers. You give 4 different perspectives, 4 different interpretations. And person 5 talks with person 6, and 7 talks with 8. And then you merge all those views together. That could probably be done as much as 1 more time. And say 16 is the maximum number of people that should ever look at something if it's really uncertain. But the most efficient way to do it and not have it depend on 1 or 2 reviewers would be to say have 4 for everybody, and 4 will probably be enough in many cases to get to clear yes or a clear no. And when you expand the number of people who look where it's more ambiguous. Informally, there's certainly precedence for that policy in many organizations that they're trying to hire, where a number of people will do the interview, and if it's hard to decide, you increase the number of reviewers that have an interview with a person, and that seems like that system can work pretty well for what's being done here.
There's a few things that, as I've been hearing this, that might be helpful to share the stats at this point. Everyone's good with that. So I'll share. There's quite a bit. to draw together here. Okay, so let's start with first framing it around Andy's first question, which was like about people's incentives. And I think what Boyana shared is that the way at least I've understood it is that there's a strong intrinsic incentive for people to serve in terms of why they're choosing to be reviewers, and I think that feels kind of right. It feels kernel-y to me. But what we're noticing, at least so far, is that we don't have a strong incentive to reject people, right? So, and rejection is a hard thing to do, and so, and the reason I want to start with this is because there's some interesting patterns that come up when we look at, for example, how were people, what rating were people given on their initial review, and then how did those groups go on to participate? So one thing we've noticed is that people with like the top score was a unicorn, and then there was the next highest score was the OK hand, and there were fewer unicorns because that was sort of implied in different places to be top 10%. Whereas, but what we saw happen was that unicorns participated at an equal intensity to the OK hands, but they dropped off much faster. We also can say that, and this is to Joanne's point, that to keep in mind that with privacy issues, with when I'm applying, whom am I applying to? Do I have confidence? Do I know what to say? Do I sell myself well? We skewed heavily to US, and then that was half of the people who come in are US, and then Canada and UK are the next big group. Then Western Europe is next, like Western continental Europe. And it turns out that the Americans tend to churn out much faster than any other geographical group, and the Western Europeans tend to stay the longest, with an exception that in KB5 it seemed to be Asia, and that we think has to do with like Sid's participation as a steward and guide at that time. But there's something to be said for the pipeline problem here, which is that what data are we not seeing? Who are we seeing not applied based on how we've presented that type of thing? So, but if we step back, there's something here in terms of as we're thinking about how to design a review process now, onward participation in the program is hugely impactful. As in a peer learning program, the more people we have drop out, the harder it is for everybody to participate. You just notice people dropping out, so you're kind of losing the vibe. But also things like matchmaking become like disproportionately difficult and time-consuming for stewards to do. So there's a big reason here for us to think about retention as a useful measure of is the review process we're designing optimized to some degree for retention, and then further than that, does it optimize for widening the pipeline and inviting people who are more likely to participate to apply, right? So that's one thing, and this relates to Juan's comment about this sort of cyclical effect. And here I would like to draw our attention to Web3 culture and airdrops and launch pads and being an insider show a specific pattern of like regression towards the mean, right? And being on the inside. And so we belong to that culture, even though I think we sit on a very altruistic, extreme of most of like crypto culture, but still that pattern is something that I think we should be aware of. And what Boyana described, and I'm going to try and choose my words not non-judgmentally, also relate to the data in an interesting way, but there is still collusion. It's involuntary collusion. It is altruistic collusion, but nonetheless, when you are checking with other people who are like you, who you trust, that is a form of collusion. And the data has shown us that people who either recommended a lot of people or somehow got a lot of their recommendations in, those people were less likely to be active participants. So people who made 1 or 2 recommendations, usually they got like 50% chance that the reco would become a fellow. Those were good recommendations. Anyone who did more than that tended to have lower participation, and that is harmful in terms of the participation and, like, onward matchmaking effects. Optimism had an interesting approach to this. They noticed that they chose a bunch of great reviewers to choose who should get retrospective funding. They then realized that they had picked pretty much all Americans, with putting their attention on American projects, and lo and behold, most of the funding went to American projects. And Vitalik had written about this, saying notably very few Chinese projects, which skewed against a lot of, like, the mining community within Ethereum, which was in that case not a good thing. And so this points to, I think, one of the issues around how do we find different forms of balance within kernel. And I think a few people have made this point of, like, who the reviewers are. By choosing who the reviewers are, we can choose those in a more intentional way. So, for example, if we need more Indian reviewers because we don't know how to review, this case, we can maybe in some ways have like an emergent thing where we need reviewers who know about X. Or if we want more builders because we've noticed differences in behavior between blocks because we saw that KB4 had more builders in it than KB7, then we want more builders to be reviewers, or by gender, however we want to do that. I think there's something to be thought through there. But then the counter to that is anything we do that looks like a popularity contest, even if that's implicit, communicates that in terms of culture, and then it becomes seen as an insider, which again is a counterbalance. So I'll leave it there. That's sort of the whirlwind tour. But I was just trying to answer all the points I've heard with either data we've seen within kernel or analogous programs that might have some lessons learned to share with us.
Thank you, Sal. Wonderful. I wonder, we have 5 more minutes. We can extend if we like. So are there other thoughts about who gets to review? How do we incentivize it? Or the particular aspects of the process which have been Brennan and others, please feel free.
I've been looking a lot into like quadratic voting mechanisms recently, and one of the really interesting things is like this pairwise method that Vitalik proposed, where you look at the degree to which any pair of donors, their like pattern of grants is correlated. And the more correlated your pattern is with the person in your pair, the power of that pair decreases. And so like that's a method for Sybil resistance, of making sure people don't spread out their money across many wallets. But it also helps to ensure that like just because there's a bias in the sample towards a perspective, that to some extent that bias is attenuated, like when it's clear that it is like a broad pattern of like the same things being picked by a non-diverse group of people. So I don't know if that is something, I mean, obviously we're not using a quadratic mechanism, but it could be interesting to look at the degree to which like if reviewer A and reviewer B voted the exact same way on 8 out of 10 applications, maybe that's a sign that they're from the same cultural group, and we can infer that without having to collect that data from people and store it and make decisions on it, which may be sensitive for some people. Like if there's a way that we can look at the degree to which that collusion is happening through the correlation of people's reviews. I don't know, that could be interesting, though of course it adds complication.
Yeah, I want to, the collusion that Sel is referring to in the data is mostly around referrals, which, as he says, we haven't really like discussed so far because there's no notion of referral at the moment. And I think that I'm going to kick that one because I just for scope in KB8, not that there will never be any referrals, just that like I don't think we're going to get there for KB8, and it's like an ongoing discussion that we need to have as to how it applies and what shape it gives to like the ongoing like peer learning community. The other thing, just in response to that, again, like once there are like thousands of people like in kernel services, then it's very easy. For instance, we have this notion of groups over which we can do correlation discounting very easily. We don't need, you know, quantum correlatives from Glenn to understand that we can do like simple correlation discounting based on groups that you're in. If there's like a particular group that reviews one person, we can do that. And it's a nice idea. Yeah, the place that I also want to just maybe like nudge us towards again is like it seems from a lot of discussions, and this one included, particularly like some of the reflections from Lisa and John, like leads us like a little bit further toward like some kind of self-selection, which I think is really powerful. In my own mind, like signing the criteria, whatever those criteria end up being, is like wonderful because we have that already in signature economies, and like that could be all that is required to like give you reviewer privileges. Nothing further than that. So I wonder if people have thoughts about like that's just like, is self-selection and signing a thing enough? Do we need to go a step further? Yeah, that's certainly top of mind for me out of this discussion.
Should people also commit to spending a minimum amount of time doing reviews? Would that be a reasonable thing to ask?
What is your intuition there, John?
So my intuition is that if there's no such requirement, then I think a lot of us might be so curious that we would just say, yes, I agree with the criteria because I would like to read the applications. And then we get everyone being officially a reviewer with all the access, but with no real commitment. So my intuition is that if there was a requirement to spend, say, 5 hours of time, or just some kind of commitment in there, then people would not sign up only out of curiosity. They would also actually ask themselves, am I willing to commit to this? Am I willing to be a responsible reviewer and not just a curious person?
One of this raises a lot, and I generally wouldn't, because I know Vivek has some things to say, but this raises an important pattern for me personally. I don't think that this has to be like universally the case, but like we want to inflame people's curiosity, right? Like it's a learning environment, and I think that like when it comes to services and the technical work that we're doing, like the default should be to defenders, like defense mindsets rather than permission. So like, and what I mean by that in this particular context is that like, rather than like putting a permission gate up front, it would be easy enough to like have a like to write a task that looks at the current set of reviewers, and if you haven't reviewed more than 3 applications in the last 4 months, your privileges are revoked, and you need to like go through the process again. Like that's kind of what I mean by like defend rather than like put the gate up first. But that would be my please, John and Bojana. John first.
So I'd like to add that my intuition or my thought was also around protecting the applicants by not allowing 1,000 people to have access to the applications. So that's kind of in the back of my mind in everything I'm saying, because that seems important to me personally, but of course that's, yeah. So just to explain where I'm coming from too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think we're all in agreement on that, truly. The question is like, is that most usefully done again through like gating it, or through just limiting the amount of information we collect in the first place? And is there like a balance to be found there, or is like any information at all, is that just revealing? I think all of these perspectives have validity, so I'm very much with you, and it's just a question of like the multi-dimensional trade-offs and seeing like where we can find a good place. But now there are lots of hands. Boyana, you had your hand raised first. I want to just give you the option if you have a moment.
Yeah.
And Brennan.
I connected it a little bit with kind of indicating of how much time somebody would like to spend, and like there was an kind of from the interviews I did, people wish to be able to at least say, I have that much capacity this week and I'm taking responsibility for it. So kind of to like still indicate I have that much time. But still, this is kind of not necessarily, it goes more towards optimizing the process rather than deciding on who gets, to review. So yeah, I just connected that to like the reviewers valuing their time and really wanting to contribute, but still wanting, being able to contribute even with limited.
Charles. Then Brennan. Sorry, Brennan.
Thank you. It's sort of off of what has been discussed, but it's about the Convo tool, and I just wanted to place it as, especially to whomever is most involved or connected with evolving that and improving it. Then I would love to propose a junto about juntos and the junto tool, perhaps for next week. So I just we can take it into the channel, but I just wanted to see. Again, place that and fish for the windows that line up with those who especially want or need to be there. Thanks.
Totally in for that junto on juntos. I wanted to do this in KB 7 and I didn't have time, so that's an awesome idea. I think maybe let's do this. Just so you know, I'm right now just focused on feature parity for what's in Convo right now with services, right? So right now it's there's not a lot of bandwidth for like figuring out a new direction. It's more like just getting what we have in terms of functionality ready to go within the new platform.
I'm all about it. I mean, just
but then after that, like that would be a great time. That's just in terms of timing.
So the other quick thing is like just I'm eyeing the possibility of like becoming a super user of this tool and juntos and stuff. So without overreaching or overdoing it, I mean, in my recent experience, there's some sort of holes or loose ends. That's kind of it. Thanks.
I'd love to hear them. Like if without even the junto, like any of that input, definitely anytime or at your convenience. Yeah, nice.
Great.
Thanks.
Awesome. If there's nothing else, I can jump in. So I think a important question around like the question of data that we haven't asked yet is like when or if the data gets deleted. And I think having a more explicit conversation around that can help us to better understand like our own, like the implications of our concerns around privacy and protecting applicants. So like we are collecting this data with the purpose of getting to know people and admitting them to kernel. I think there's also like the implied purpose of porting that data over to their profile, though I don't think applicants understand that super well. I didn't understand that super well as an applicant. But like, we have this data, which may be sensitive for some people. and we are using it for a specific purpose, but that data endures beyond its purpose. So what if we just either after somebody was accepted, or I don't, if we have rolling admissions open at all times, maybe just when a block is started and all those applicants get rolled into it, those applications get deleted. Like, I don't know, if that data isn't around forever, it can only be misused in a finite period of time, which helps to decrease the, I guess for me personally, like it feels less scary. I know it's not super blockchain, as Swan is pointing out, right? Immutable data ledgers and whatnot, but maybe it's good for some things to be deleted, and that can help soften the edges around this question of the potential for misuse or just exposure that somebody doesn't expect or want. That's it.
It's a good question. I would love to hear from Simon on this. My personal opinion is that like we don't need to make it that clear in the flow at the moment that like what you apply with then like appears in your profile, because you see your profile if you get accepted, and you can adapt it or delete it at your will, and but like that's when the data gets changed or removed. If you don't, that's not something that we've talked about yet. So like if an applicant is rejected, what happens it's not an explicit discussion that we've had yet. So Simon, I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, or if I'm just behind the times, because inevitably I am.
Yeah, I mean that there's no correlation right now between the profile and application. It's just something we talked about when you do create your profile, that we could pre-populate it at that time. So just to kind of cut down. But in general, the storage service is more the general philosophy behind it is sort of that you own your own data. So if whatever entities that you are the owner of, you have access to delete as well. So that's more some of the larger tech companies, they have a service called like Takeout, where you can kind of say like, hey, give me all the data that you have about me. And that's also sort of in relation to GDPR and some of the other privacy acts, where if you come to us and say like, hey, I want you to delete all the data that you have about me, we need to be able to do that. So that's sort of with that in mind. So that's a feature that I had in the back of my mind in the future, just in general, to solve that problem, where you can say like, hey, give me all the data that the storage service knows where I'm the owner, and then you can either export it, or you can say like delete all of it, right, and just wipe me from your system. So that's sort of where I stand with that. But I agree with you, Bren. I think the notion of forgetting is very important. I think having something data expire explicitly, right, after a certain amount of time. I think that those are very interesting concepts on the storage layer that I thought about too. So I'd love to think about those in more general terms. Yeah, I'm always trying to just give the user as much power as possible. So if you want to keep the application around, right, because you're proud of it, you should be able to do that. If you want to delete it, you should be able to delete it, right? So that's sort of where I come from. Yeah, and instead of delete, we can also anonymize it, right? So if there's certain things you want to keep around, but we can take something and anonymize it, and then delete the original thing, but keep the anonymized version. We want to do some analysis and things like that. So anyway, but those are great questions, right? So we can none of this has been decided, and all of it can be implemented. It's just a question of policy.
Wonderful. I know that we are a long way over, and I really appreciate everybody's extra 15 minutes. The last thing that I just wanted to touch on very briefly, like just two things about the current interface. I can put these into bugs, but it's just worth being aware of, is that like I have some questions about it. Like the first is only the 10 most recent reviews show up, and like Simon, you've been doing some testing there recently, so like I can see all of your test ones and not a lot of other people on staging. Secondly, it doesn't always record once I've voted. And thirdly, in terms of that interface, I wonder, because at the moment it just shows the number, not like the name of the person or anything. And I wonder if that was on purpose or if it's just kind of like a quick and easy interface thing, just show the number for now, rather than translating it to the name of that applicant, or if you had deeper thoughts about that.
Yeah, I suppose just the easier thing, because the application doesn't have the name. It certainly shouldn't bias you, right? You should be objective. So having a name already biases you in selecting it. So, but it's most of it is, but it should be the last 10. So it just shows you new ones. So if you already voted, if the application has been admitted, then it shouldn't show you. And then recording should definitely, yeah. If you have an example, I'm not saying there's no bugs. So, that shouldn't be the case. There might be a delay if there's lots of people voting at the same time. You may notice a delay, but
amazing. Yeah. Okay, that's good. There are lots of conversational threads I hope that we've been able to lay, which we can discuss asynchronously in Slack. I will be on holiday for the next 2 weeks, but these calls will continue. And I really encourage everybody to like think deeply about these. Like one of the ones that we only touched on, but Vivek raised, which I think is like critical, is like currently we have like 5 voting options: thumbs down, thumbs up, clap hands, okay hand, unicorn, and like a unicorn is 5 points, for instance, right? And like 15 points is the point at which applicants pass. And as Simon says, those applications are no longer visible on the review screen, which solves one of those problems. But like, what happens if 15 people give a thumbs up as opposed to 3 people giving like a unicorn? Those are very, very different signals. And how do we allow for those? How do we think about affordances in general is something. The current criteria assume that instead of these 5 options, we will have thumbs up, thumbs down, only that, and for different sort of sincerity, intention, and like willingness to learn, different categories, thumbs up, thumbs down, so that it's not just like a simple affordance, but you have to think about it. It's seamless, but it's not mindless. That was the way that I thought about it. But you know, there's many other options, and it does relate, as I said, to like Vivek's points about like how many people get to see reviews. How do we ensure that like this thing of like 15 1 points versus 3 5 points doesn't affect it? These are all really, really good questions. And finally, I will say that there is also like a proposals application by which you can put forward a proposal for things to happen in kernel. And that proposal, it's staging.proposals.kernel.community. It also will no doubt need to adapt to the conversations that we have with it and the uses to which we put it. But that means that we need to use it. So if you want to make a proposal about how reviews should work, or how we can make things more permeable, or how self-selection might be enacted, just give it a whirl, right? That doesn't have to be a serious thing. We're all friends, yeah, and it's nice just to sort of get a sense of how we might construct those interfaces through conversation to bring us toward real cohesion and a collective pattern that really works for us in increasingly wise ways. That is wise, that makes us more wise, that makes our relationships more wise. Yeah. So if there are any further comments, please, Bojana.
Just one quick thing on the numbers instead of names in the application kind of list. While I was doing tests, one person went into there quickly, and that's potential usability problem in the future, especially when you have lots of, like if you have 5, it's already hard, but if you have like 500, it's going to be completely impossible for somebody who's reading an application, needs to go away for a little bit, think about it, come back and make a decision. It's impossible for them to find the application again. And there's already kind of self-correction going on in terms of bias. So I'm not really sure that's going to be a huge problem if the names are, if bias is your concern. I don't think it's going to be a big problem to show the names, since there's already self-correction in there. That's all I wanted to say.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Last thoughts? You have the option while we turn to...
One maybe last thought is it does seem a lot of what's going to affect this is actually the choices we make as to the reviewers and the types of marks we make, and just being able to experiment on these things in some way, whether it's through some subgroups that follow their own sub definitions for what those things are, like what especially as all those have their own feedback loops. It seems that finding some ways to experiment and see what it gets us in terms of the outcomes that we want be useful.
Very true. Subgroups and federation. We need to have this discussion, and it's one that can be started asynchronously as well. You'll find a little bit about federation in the engineering manifesto in the Kernel Building Kernel adventure. I recommend starting there, and then just bothering Simon for 2 weeks while I'm away about what is federation and how does it apply to JWTs and why are these things even being used, and how did you become a mad scientist? Any other questions that you have for Emma? There we go. Thank you very much, everyone. Lovely, lovely, lovely to see you all. And I wish you a very happy weekend.